Yes.
Hi, so desu.
Hi.
I'm now just in Guwahati airport, and maybe this condition may not be ideal, but sorry if I'm disturbing.
Oh, you're in the airport.
In
Yeah,
Guwahati.
in Guwahati. Yeah.
Guwahati.
Yes, yes, yes. Hi, Pallavi-san, nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you. Yoroshiku onegaishimasu.
Yeah,
You know,
let's go on, guys.
it's amazing technology, like how we are connecting from all over the world and different places, and the airport in Assam and California and
Yes. Yes.
Spain. It sort of boggles the mind.
Yeah.
Yes, yes, yes.
I'm in Dehradun
Amazing, amazing.
Mountains, in the foothills.
Wow.
I'm in the foothills.
Wow. No, it's
Wow,
incredible that we can all sort of come together despite geographical location. It really,
Yes.
Where are you, Lakshmi?
I'm in Delhi.
You're
I'm in Delhi. Yes, yes.
Pallavi's in Spain.
yes, and Sato-san is in the Guwahati airport, which I think is
Yes.
like the most exotic of all of us.
Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
Truly.
What are you doing in Assam?
Just I attended the Cherry Blossom Festival in Shillong, Sikkim. No. Meghalaya.
In Meghalaya.
Yeah.
Yokata. Beautiful.
Very, yeah. Now just Sakura was in bloom. in
I
Shillong.
didn't even know there was Sakura in
May have been gifted by the Japanese.
right.
Yeah.
Right.
Right.
Like in Washington, D.C., I was there in Easter last year, and they have beautiful cherry blossoms,
Yes.
also gifted by the Japanese.
Yes, they were all
decades
gifted by Japan. They were gifted by Japan. And
Pallavi, can we start?
Yes, I
Hi.
can
Yes.
ready.
Lakshmi?
Yes, yes, sir. Yes, please, sir.
Hi, friends. Good afternoon. Konnichiwa. Namaskar. I welcome you to this 14th monthly lecture of Kizuna India-Japan Study Forum. As you know, the forum was launched September 2022. And this forum has been set up by Mosai to bring out lesser researched aspects of India-Japan historical and cultural connections. This has come out, the forum has emerged out of 2 international conferences, the proceedings of which have been published. I'm delighted that today we have a very unique unearthing of connection between India and Japan, which is based on personal, sensitive life of Pallavi in Japan. Pallavi, as you know, is a foreign correspondent and an author, and currently based in Madrid. She is the deputy editor-in-chief of the online magazine, The Globalist. She is truly a globalist. Major publications include Orienting and Indian in Japan, published in 2021. A New Old World. An Indian journalist discovers the changing face of Europe. That was the earlier work in 2015. She served as an advisor to the Confederation of Indian Industry on China-related issues. In 2010, she was recognized by Chinese Premier Wen Jianbao for her work in furthering Sino-Indian relations. We have an equally learned, experienced discussant, Mr. Koji Sato. Welcome to you, Sato-san. He is the Director General of the Japan Foundation, New Delhi, since 2021. He joined the Japan Foundation in 1995. Incidentally, his first overseas assignment was also in India. That was in 2013. After that, he had served several overseas offices of the Japan Foundation in Cairo, Egypt, and Myanmar. We have a very competent chairperson for this seminar, a scholar from Jawaharlal Nehru University, Dr. M.V. Lakshmi. Welcome, Lakshmi.
Thank you, sir.
She has been in the faculty of the Center for Japanese Studies, JNU, since 2002. She has worked on the portrayal of India in modern Japanese fiction in her PhD thesis. She has continued to explore the theme of modern Japanese fiction in other genres as well. She has written many books, chapters, journal articles, and co-authored school-level textbooks for the Japanese at class 6, 7, and 8. Her research interests also include comparative culture and Chinese literature, in children's literature. I know MV is also read and reviewed Pallavi's book. So over to you, MV. Please conduct the lecture.
Thank you, Dr. Jain. And good afternoon to everyone. Just 2 minutes back, Professor Sushila Narasimhan Sensei was saying that she has been chasing Pallavi for some time. I must say I've been chasing you since 4 years, in almost 3 years actually, since I first found your book. And so today, what I would want to discuss before Pallavi starts her talk is how her book actually occupies this extremely special space, which is by an Indian who writes about Japan as an expatriate. So like in Japan, there have been famous expatriate writings, but which have been largely written by not people from India, definitely, and by people from the Western world. And some big names amongst these would be Lafcadio Johann. Then, of course, Hugh has written his Glimpses of Unfamiliar Japan. Then there has been Donald Ritchie, who has written The Inland Sea. Then a few more, like Alex Kerr, who has written Lost Japan. There's Pico Aiyar, who has written Beginner's Guide to Japan, and The Lady and the Monk, and some more, and which we may have all read at some point of time, and which particularly have interested me since I try to follow how Japan has been read by, even understood by people from outside. And when it comes to fiction, again, like Dr. Jain said, I had the opportunity to work on a few works of modern fiction where India was depicted, such as Endo Shusaku, Akutagawa Ryunosuke, or Michima Yukio. When it comes to non-fiction, like before coming to your work, there are travelogues which explore Japan as well. Then there are tourist perspectives as well, which have been written, and there are many books available. So not as many by Indians, but other people who have gone to Japan, and they do give a very interesting perspective as well. But what really has caught my attention with your genre of writing is that having lived in Japan, you have explored a space in which you had a possible luxury of framing your perceptions, and also reframing them in the 4-year stay, which I understand you have had in the country. And it offers a very fresh perspective from an Indian woman expat in Japan, and which also is interesting because perhaps, I mean, it is of course for you to talk about the book, but it perhaps breaks some stereotypes which we may have formed or which I may have come across in fictional writing, and also uh, which make it a very real and yet uh, a very interesting read. So it has it has been a very interesting read, and as against diaspora or migrants or immigrants or travelers, the space that your book has possibly offered to explore is one that has been very interesting, and we look forward to your talk. Thank you very much. So,
Invite.
yeah,
Pallavi.
so could we request Pallavi to take over the floor and start with her talk? I think you're muted. I think you are on mute.
We can't hear you, Pallavi.
I'm so sorry. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Yes, I was just saying that I'm sorry that I lost connection for the last few minutes when Lakshmi was speaking, but I was just able to get back in. However, I caught the beginning and very touched by your sensitive reading and introduction of the book. And before I begin, I just wanted to really thank the Kizuna India-Japan Study Forum. As you mentioned, so Sheila Ji has been in touch with me for the last yeah, it's been about 2 years now, and there have been various obstacles along the way. So I'm really especially pleased that we were finally able to make it and get together to have this discussion today. And a great thanks also to Dr. Ashok Jain for having extended the invitation. I was very pleased to find out that something like this forum actually exists, because as an Indian in Japan, which is the subtitle of my book, I actually have a copy of the book over here, Orienting an Indian in Japan. It was quite a lonely space in that I wasn't aware of sort of groups with people from Japan and India that sort of brought together these common interests in the way that Kizuna India does. And at the same time, I do feel like a bit of an imposter today as well, because I come to this as an amateur, I come to this as an observer, and I'm here amongst, great scholars and people who have spent their lives and devoted their lives to exploring the culture of Japan and India-Japanese ties. Whereas my work is really very experiential and I hope not superficial. I tried to the best of my ability to really explain what it was like to have a country that you did not know so much about sort of unfold in front of your eyes over a period of 4 years. So as Lakshmi said, to frame it, but then also to reframe it as time went by. So I thought today I'd just talk a little bit about some of the issues that I raise in the book. There's obviously too many to go into all of them, but just a smattering. Again, and I think also starting from that point of innocence and lack of knowledge about Japan, really, when I sort of washed up on its shores back in 2016. Because the fact is that I've spent much of this 21st century living in different parts of Asia. And so I had considered myself in some ways to be an Asianist. I had lived in China for 7 or 8 years between 2002 and 2009. I also lived in Indonesia, in Jakarta, for 4 years. Immediately before moving to Japan. So that was between 2012 and 2016. And of course, I am from India, right? So all in all, I saw myself as an Asianist. But when I realized that we would be moving to Japan, because my husband is a diplomat, and so this would be a diplomatic posting taking us to Tokyo, I was suddenly confronted by the fact that I'd been sort of missing a very critical piece of this so-called Asian jigsaw puzzle, because all the other Asian countries I'd known, China, India, Indonesia, what they had in common was this kind of upward trajectory, this thrust of people and commerce. Delhi and Beijing and Jakarta were noisy, chaotic, dynamic, heaving cities, and they were kind of in this process of coming out onto the international stage. But Japan was an anomaly, it was an exception. Firstly, of course, its geographical location on the very eastern edge of the map. I think it served as a kind of metaphor. I mentioned that in the book, of its seeming separateness from the rest of Asia. It was rich, it was quiet, it was old and punctual and rule obsessed, so unlike these other cities which were loophole hungry, and so my learning curve was very steep, because I really came from, it might all be Asia, but it could have been another planet in many ways. And so I suppose my initial months were the most crucial, because I believe, as somebody who's been sort of condemned to movement, given my life, I've been changing countries every 4 years, pretty much for the last 25 years. As somebody who has been condemned to movement, one lesson I've learned is that the first 6 months in a new place are often the most crucial, because this is the period when you really, really experience the place with all your senses and all your synapses firing, when you actually listen to conversations, where you notice body language and how people hold themselves, when you look at the titles of books that they might be reading, when you look at the trees and you look at the manhole covers, and you smell the smells, and you sort of drink it all in, before which it sort of becomes banal and quotidian and everyday and starts receding into the everyday normal. So there's this period when your environment becomes normalized. But before that period, that first 6 months when everything is wondrous, I think it's a very interesting time. And what was it about Japan? Like every country, I think things kind of really sort of stand out to you, sort of that are surprising to you. And the two things for me in Tokyo, I think in that first month, 2 months, when I sort of come in there as a Japan virgin, as it were that it was almost supernaturally, for an Indian who had just come from Indonesia, clean. So it was the cleanliness aspect. And of course, that it was very, very safe. And that very, very safe point was driven home, I think, more than anything else, by the fact that you saw these little children who were 6 years old and 7 years old traversing this enormous metropolis of Tokyo with 30 million people on their own. So it must have been my second day in Tokyo when I saw a little child, who was very tiny, 5 or 6 years old, heaving this school bag that was nearly as big as him and wandering down a busy Tokyo road. And coming from my background, I assumed that he was lost. And I remember telling my husband, "Oh, look at that child." And I was going to run after him and ask if he needed help and try to contact the police. But before I could do that, I saw him pulling out a Metro card and kind of going into the bowels of the Tokyo Metro. And he was obviously this practiced flaneur. And it was incredible in many ways, because this is unthinkable in almost every other big city that I've lived in: New Delhi, London, Los Angeles, Beijing, Jakarta. That elementary school age children would be hopping onto buses and changing trains and subway stations. But in Japan, this was completely unremarkable. And as all of you know, that it's common. Sorry? Sorry, as all of you know, that it's quite common in Japan for children to begin traveling to school by themselves from grade 1 of primary school at the age of 6. And what was also interesting to me was the role of the convenience store or the konbini in all of this, which has also emerged as another symbol that's kind of emblematic of Japan, with books like Convenience Store Woman, for example. But what was interesting was that it was these convenience stores that were designated as sort of safe spots for many of these children, so that if they ever ran into trouble or if there was a natural disaster, as indeed there often have been in Japan, these were places where they could take shelter, which then took me into this whole world of the konbini, which is again unavoidable if you live in Japan, because it's so much part of the weft and warp of daily life. And, discovered that there were upwards of 55,000 7-Elevens and family marts and other konbinis, so that I think there were even more konbinis than there were Shinto shrines in the country. So really a ubiquitous feature of the landscape. And any lost or distressed child could ask to use the phone at one of these stores and wait there until their parents came to collect her. So I think the question in my mind, and the question that would arise in most people's minds when I would tell them about this, was how had this miracle been achieved? Because to anyone with kids in, say, Delhi, where parents live in this constant state of anxiety about the safety of their children, this is almost like, pigs flying. I mean, if you say that my 6-year-old can, wander around on their own and go to school, it's near miraculous, right? So what were the reasons? I think there's obviously a concatenation of reasons. To begin with, violent crime in Japan is quite low. And despite having a substantial population, 127 million, I think, there were under 1,000 murders that were reported annually during the time that I lived there. So very, very tiny percentage of violent crimes. Public infrastructure was excellent. So trains were regular, supernaturally on time again. I think one of my favorite anecdotes is about an incident in 2017 when I was there, when there was an express line between Tokyo and Tsukuba, the city of Tsukuba just outside Tokyo. And it ended up departing 20 seconds early, not even 20 seconds late, but 20 seconds early. And the line's management issued the sincere apology, and the newspapers were full of it the next day. And the apology was confessing that the crew had not sufficiently checked the departure time and had caused so much inconvenience to people. So, it really did feel like another planet. But I think the sort of dependability of the public transport infrastructure was another explanation for how children could navigate the city in the way that they did. And then I think that the most crucial ingredient was a kind of accepted reliance on community, which made Tokyo almost more reminiscent of a village rather than of a big city culture, because you had such a high degree of public trust, which was what was amazing. In a village, you can imagine children wandering around on their own because people know each other. But when you have a city of 30 million people, people do not know each other, which is why there ends up being this sense of fear in most urban contexts. But I do think that there was this high degree of public trust in Tokyo. You had retirees volunteering to usher children across roads safely as they walked to school. My own children eventually traveled on their own. By the time my son was about 10 years old, he not only traveled unaccompanied, but he took his younger brother, who was 7 years old, with him. And, if this scenario had been described to me when I still lived in Indonesia, I would have, like I said, thought it likelier for my children to sprout wings and fly home rather than travel alone. And the worst thing that ever happened to them during these 4 years was that they lost a lunchbox on the bus, which brings me to the second point that I also make in the book, and that's really struck me in my initial years, was how Japan was a country where what is lost is almost always found. I think the lost and found in Japan is another one of those absolutely miraculous things. And I remember looking into some of the statistics and seeing that conscientious finders had handed more than 4.5 million items to the Metropolitan Police, and that in fact the number of found items that were handed in were 4 times the number of actual complaints being filed by people to recover stuff. And it was not just lunch boxes, but even hard cash. And that across Japan, there was an 87% chance of finding lost money, which I think is really something quite incredible. So again, what accounted for this marvel? Did the Japanese have morally superior DNA to the rest of the world? Or did eating sushi make you a better person? Was it the cultural influence of Zen Buddhism? Or was it simply because of the fact that you had local police stations, Koban, that was so easy to locate? They were there on almost every road. Every 150 meters you could find one. So maybe it just made it infrastructurally, administratively easy to report incidents. And I think over the years, I just came to the conclusion that trust breeds trust, that good deeds encourage good deeds, that if someone has taken the trouble to turn in your lunchbox to the police, then if you find somebody else's lunchbox, you are more likely to do the same for somebody in the future. And like, in short, it's the result of the normalization of civic behavior. And I think this normalization really accounted for this village-like level of public faith in this urban jungle. Because from a very young age, this kind of hierarchy of values was drilled into Japanese children from kindergarten, in school, at home. I think where the comfort and needs of other people, of others, are kind of placed at the same level as your own, perhaps even higher, which is why people were discouraged from talking loudly in public, so you didn't impinge on the oral space of others. It's why Japanese football fans famously clean up after themselves after a big game, why people were always on time for appointments, because to be late is disrespectful of the time of others. And there were many ways in which this sense of community and the prioritization of the other was sort of drilled in. Like in school, children took turns cleaning classrooms and toilets instead of relying on staff. At construction sites, there was a big construction site opposite my house. Every morning you would see the workers joining in communal exercises before beginning the day's labor. So you had this kind of collective performance of activities which fostered a sense of joint ownership of that space, and I think the value of civic conduct. Now, these are, in some ways, it could seem like utopian aspects of Japanese society: safety, trust, cleanliness, punctuality. But I think what I try to examine in the book, and it's the flip side of the coin, is the suppression of the self, the suppression of idiosyncrasy, the suppression of spontaneity, the suppression of risk-taking. And, I think there was such a social consensus on the importance of the preservation of ethnic homogeneity, the sense that we all had to be Japanese because Japanese understood what it means. And that if we allowed in outsiders, then all of this would get disrupted. The fact that we can have these village level sense of security and so on would get disrupted when you get outsiders, because the social trust would decline. And from thence also came this wariness and suspicion of immigrants. And I mean, the other thing that really stood out was that Japan, being an OECD country and advanced economy, was taking something like 30 asylum seekers a year only, despite receiving 11,000, 12,000 applications a year. and the foreign resident population was something like 2% of the population in Japan, compared to other developed countries where the foreign-born population in the United States is about 15%, in Germany, 12%, in Russia, 12%. So you see a huge difference over there. And of course, during the time I lived there, the government gradually relaxed its immigration policy because, as we know, Japan is kind of caught in the demographic pincers of a declining birth rate and an aging population. But I think the whole question of immigration and what it means to be foreign in Japan remains a question that is kind of fraught. Now, I don't have too much time left, about another 5 minutes. Is that right, Lakshmi?
I think till 3:40 should be fine.
So 10 minutes.
It is,
Okay.
yes.
So what I wanted to talk about, and this was something that Sushila has been asking me, so it's like a special request from her, is a little bit about the connection between Japan and India through the story and the history of curry food. Ask the average person outside of Japan, like me, before I moved to Japan, what is Japan's national dish? And I think most people would say sushi, they might say soba. But once I was in Japan, I discovered that at least an equal contender is curry, right? The Japanese Navy even had like Curry Friday traditions where all the Navy canteens offered curry and rice on Friday, every Friday. And of course, I went and tasted this curry. And in the average kind of curry in Japan only bears a superficial resemblance to its Indian ancestor. It's more glutinous. It's often mixed in with wheat flour. It's much sweeter, and it can sometimes have ingredients like honey, which we don't usually have in Indian curry. But I think the reasons for that, as I discovered, have to do with the history of the dish, which is not direct contact between India and Japan, but it is contact that is mediated. We often see that historical and cultural contacts between India and Japan are mediated via China. In this case, it was mediated by the British, because as far as I could make out from my research, the curry in Japan really kind of came in the 1870s, when naval officers of the British Royal Navy, who had started to eat curry due to the connection with India, the colonial connection in India, passed it on to Japanese colleagues in the Japanese Navy, which is why it is still the Navy that has this kind of curry Friday every week, even today. And the earliest recipes for raisu curry in Japanese cookbooks, they didn't come from India, but they came from the British cookbook, Mrs. Beeton's Book of Household Management. And it was this recipe that included curry powder, flour, sour apples, and so on. And what's interesting is that in Japan, because for many Japanese, the dish did not come from India, it came from the West, it came from the British. And so it was often classified as Western food rather than Asian food. But I discovered that there was one restaurant in Tokyo that had historically prided itself as serving authentic Indian curry with no wheat, no apples, no holds bar on the chili, and this was Nakamuraya, right, in Shinjuku. And I went and I visited the restaurant and learned about its history and its role in introducing authentic Indian curry to Japan. And it was a fantastic story, a rip-roaring yarn which had revolutionary fugitives from India, love affair, and one of Japan's leading bakeries. Great ingredients for a story. And that Indian, of course, is Rash Bihari Bose, who in some circles in Japan is even more famous than Subhash Chandra Bose, who is the Bose that we in India most usually have a kind of resonance with Japan. And Rash Bihari Bose was born in 1886. And after graduating, he worked in the forest department in Dehradun. but he became a anti-colonial revolutionary, particularly influenced by the agitation following the partition of Bengal in 1905. And in 1912, he was involved in an assassination attempt against the Viceroy of India, Lord Hardinge. So at this point, he became a wanted man in India, and he needed to become a fugitive and leave post haste. And as the colonial authorities closed in on him, he fled to Japan in 1915. And what's another historical tidbit that's interesting is that he made his way first to Kobe under the name of P.S. Thakur, and he pretended to be a relative of Rabindranath Tagore, who was going to visit Japan the following year in 1916. And once he was in Kobe, he set out for Tokyo, and he eventually made the acquaintance and became the protege of several Japanese Pan-Asianists, because there was a Pan-Asianist kind of right-wing movement in Japan at the time, people who were sympathetic to the cause of Indian independence, anti-British. And he notably became close to the right-wing politician Mitsuru Toyama. And it was Toyama who introduced him to the Soma family. And the Soma family were owners of this well-known bakery called Nakamuraya in Tokyo. And essentially Bose went into hiding with this family because the British were looking for him and he was facing extradition. And during this time, when he was in hiding, he developed a relationship with the family's eldest daughter, Toshiko, who was also his interpreter. And eventually the two of them got married in 1918. And then this made, it easier for Bose to move around Tokyo to acquire Japanese citizenship, which he did in 1923. And the couple, in fact, had 2 children, but eventually Toshiko died of pneumonia at a young age in the mid-1920s. So as far as Bose was concerned, he continued his revolutionary nationalistic activities to support the Indian national movement in Japan through writings and lectures for many years into the 1940s. But in some ways, his most lasting contribution in introducing India to Japan was in this authentic Indian curry, which he introduced in the menu of the Nakamuraya Bakery/Cafe back in 1927. And it's interesting because I read a book by Professor Takeshi Nakajima called Bose of Nakamuraya, saying that actually Bose used the curry as a way of demonstrating to the Japanese that what they were used to as curry was just a colonial invention. And getting his recipe on his personal recipe on the Nakamuraya menu was in some ways part of his anti-colonial struggle, trying to win back India's food culture from British hands. And ultimately, the curry was a hit, even though it was expensive. I believe at that time it was 8 times more expensive than the average rice soup curry. So I actually went to the restaurant and I tasted it, and the verdict is that it passed the flavor test. It was full-bodied spice, pleasing consistency. However, what's interesting is that it was served in a sauce boat, the kind of boat that you use for putting a sauce over turkey for Christmas dinner. And I think that kind of betrays its classification as Western food in Japan and the British origins that I was mentioning earlier. So I could leave it at that. I think we have another 20 minutes. So I would love to hear from Sato-san, and please to have a little bit more back and forth. There are so many other things really that I discuss in the book and that came to me. One of the things that I'm not going to go into details, but I think is always an interesting point of discussion is why I think India and China, despite having such a natural fit economically, still do not have as close a relationship bilaterally as they could on the economic front. And my answer to that is what I call the Jugaad versus Shokunin dichotomy. And we could perhaps discuss that, but I don't think I have enough time to go into that at the moment. So I'll just leave it at this point and looking forward to the next 20 minutes.
May I, at this stage, Lakshmi, intervene? We have extended the session by half an hour because I think so interesting things have been are still to come. So please, Lakshmi, you have up to 4:30
Okay.
with you.
Just but I do not have. I have about 15 minutes extra. So if it's okay, we'll go till about
I can't hear
4:15.
you.
Can you hear me now?
Sorry.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. So if I do need to leave. I have another appointment. So if we can, but I can extend by 15 minutes. So if we can go till about 4:15 India time.
Okay. Then, I mean, since we have time till 4:15, should we go on to the next speaker? I'd request Mr. Sato to please start the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Lakshmi-san. And
पंडित को क्यों नहीं हो रहा 10 मिनट बोलने देते
मैं तो कहा उसने
सबको क्लियर नहीं हुआ
Pallavi-san, thank you very much for a wonderful orientation about what you wrote beautifully. Actually, just the request just reached me, for commenting on this.
Mr. Sato's image is not in the picture. He's
sorry. Okay. Yeah. So it came to me, and just all of a sudden, just I jumped up to this wonderful book, but just I took the liberty of just reading it just in the translation. So yeah. So Professor Ryohei Kasai, he made beautiful translation, and just I gained a lot just by reading it. So, but if the maybe term just which is used may have some differences. That is due to my understanding. So just bear with me. So this wonderful book may be categorized as this one such new Nihonjin Don. Maybe Nihonjin Don means treatises of Japanese-ness. And as Pallavi-san also just introduced briefly, there are historically series of updated Nihonjin Don written by sometimes Japanese, but many times just expatriates or just foreigners. And it is also believed that Japanese people just like such welcome such Nihonjin very much. I think that is partly because the Japanese people themselves still are wondering about identity. It's just almost 150 or almost 200 years of history of modernization. But just in due course, as a nation, we had a success or a failure, and just zigzag, and just always still just we are wondering who we are, or just how we balance this tradition and the modernity. Maybe right after was in between the World War II, just there was a very controversial discussion about Kingdom of Shokoku, just overcome this modernity. And yet, after Japan becomes such a global economy, yet just we are still wondering whether we have acquired modernity. So, and always just against such question, self-question, internally or just from outside, there are many good suggestions. That is just through the so-called Nihonjin. And maybe Lakshmi-san said that that formed the some sort of stereotypical idea or image about Japan, about maybe Zen Buddhism or cleanliness or punctuality or safety or maybe four seasons, sensitivity, kind of things. And this, people say that Japan is such unique, and just by being told that we are unique, maybe more often just that's why we are good. And then just we Japanese people are relieved. Okay, whether or not just we conquer the modernity or something, but we are unique, and that proves that our latest position. But maybe Pallavi-san's book or insight also just touched upon such kind of very frequently discussed topic about cleanliness or craftsmanship or nature sensitivity, etc., etc. However, but just what is very powerful and unique is that because as an expatriate living in Japan, Pallavi-san just experienced or living the life in Japan, and maybe internalize just how Japanese people feel.
We lost the sound of Sato.
We lost you. We have lost Sato's
Behavior in the public. That is very unique, and she just such a way, although just kind of confirm such kind of stereotypical some ideas or a sensitization of Japanese, but she proves that just through her experience, and that is really have a convincing power, I think. And what I want to add one more thing is that together with the confidence about such uniqueness or social very well functioning system, at the same time just there's a flipping just anxiety, social anxiety. And she said that the Japanese people or society is hurt or in pain. And that is because she assumed that Japanese, how to say, history of maybe invasions during the conflict period. I just partly agree with that, but at the same time, maybe in parallel to such, modernity's conquest issue, I think, together with that invasion, I believe that the fact that Japan in the end just lost such war, just we lost the clue to talk about justice. So maybe still just in this modern contemporary era, this in the global discussion of justice, Japan just takes the kind of a position a little bit retreat or humbleness, not to just speak out, but rather just we are still just maybe talk about aesthetics, how to live life beautifully. Just I don't think that just that is bad or good. Just, it's kind of a judgmental just comment, but I think that's just thing that is the one such big thing that Japan in future maybe have to overcome. As you say that society itself just is kind of a weakening. There's aging population issues, and you know, Japanese economic power itself is declining. And in such cases, this how to just Japan regain this the figure or to conquer such kind of dichotomy of internal confidence as together with the anxiety. And I think just one such thing, just Pallavi-san just want to discuss further. I think is how that India just maybe can help the Japan to regain such confidence. And maybe Japan's how to say craftsmanship and India's jugaad, this very contradictory concept or this way of approaching how just we can collaborate and create a new value in the future. There is no answer, but in the diplomatic arena, there's a very big talk of Japan and India that can lead the world in the future. But the data shows that in the past 5 to 10 years, the number of Japanese companies is opening the offices in India is being stagnant to maybe 1,400 in such lines. And this on the ground, the reality is that Japanese businessmen are really struggling to work with Indian people, also Indians' environment and conditions, how to just manage or alignment with Japanese perfectionist idea and the justice Indians' jugaad side handling things. So there is no such clear solution for that. But, maybe for overcoming such gap or contradiction, I think there's such hope that Japan itself also maybe should conquer that dichotomy of traditional value and anxiety, that very contradictory spiritual or mental issues. Anyway, just I really just enjoy reading this book, and it was a privilege that get the opportunity to read in translation, and many Japanese people, I believe, should read it, as well as the Indian friends also read and discuss on this book. Thank you, Pallavi-san.
Thank you, Sato-san, for your very interesting views on the book, and that you have been reading it in Japanese, which is wonderful.
I was wondering whether Pallavi would like to take some more time, 5 minutes maybe.
Of course. So would you like me to just speak a little bit?
Yes,
All right.
please.
I think like Sato-san had brought up a little bit about the Jogar Shokunin dichotomy, and I think that that's always an interesting way to look at the bilateral relationship, both cultural and economic, both in terms of where they complement each other and also where they kind of run into roadblocks, right? So like I think in theory, there are few nations that make a better strategic fit than, we have fast growing populous India, and you have rich, demographically challenged Japan. And both countries are, let's say, wary of their neighbor China's potential hegemonic sway over Asia. India needs technical expertise and investments to develop its infrastructure, and Japan has capital to spare and know-how to share. India has this young and dynamic workforce. Japan is aging. And the two democracies, they enjoy a rare historic amity, friendship. They are geographically and culturally close, but not too close. And relations are therefore free of, contentious issues like the border disputes that they have with other countries. But, as Sato-san mentioned, in practice, Japanese companies that are in India struggle, they find it difficult, and vice versa. And in fact, the bilateral relationship is largely hamstrung. I don't have the exact figures, but if I remember correctly, the two-way trade used to be like 17, 18 billion a year when I was there, compared to like 100 billion that India did with China and 300 billion that Japan did with China. And I sort of think that one reason is this deep cultural dissonance, the Jogard Shokunin dichotomy. Jogard is about finding loopholes, right? It's about patching tears in an improvisational manner. But in Japan, such an approach is anathema. And as the audience in this particular group already knows, this whole shokunin spirit, that of the artisan, the master craftsperson, is that of the relentless pursuit of perfection through the honing of a single craft. And the shokunin spirit is embodied in, for example, the sushi chef who has to train for 10 years before he's allowed to even cut the fish, or the sake brewer who dreams of yeast at night because he's so single-mindedly focused on his practice, his art. And the fact is that the shokunin is always aware that perfection is elusive, but regardless, believes that it must never be given up on, right? And I think Hokusai, the iconic ukiyo-e artist, was probably really emblematic of this, when at the age of 90, he's supposed to have said that if only heaven would give me another 10 years, I can become a real painter. This idea that you spend your whole life chasing something, but you're nothing at the end of it. And then I remember speaking to the manager of JETRO's overseas research department in Tokyo, and he had spent 5 years in the JETRO office in India, and basically was explaining to me about why it took Japanese companies in India so much longer than their Korean or Chinese counterparts to learn how to localize their products for the Indian market. And he had specifically given me the example of air conditioners, and saying that, the Japanese mindset was so fixated on the quality of the air conditioner so that they could last forever without the need for any repairs. But in India, it was cheap to have air conditioners repaired. You had technicians, and it was easier. What made sense for people was a cheap air conditioner that you could repair later, rather than paying like 10 times the average price of an air conditioner so that you'd never have to have it repaired. So the consumer is more focused on cost than durability, more on cost than on perfection, more on jogad than on the spirit of shokunin, right? Now I think that while it has its advantages, the shokunin spirit hampers the ability of Japanese firms in countries like India, where they prize flexibility and they prize innovation. And the fact is that Japanese corporations are strongly risk averse, and it makes them very difficult to operate in a freewheeling environment where essentially there's the potential for chaos, and you need the ability to have impromptu decision making. And the rest of the world is not like Japan. And, Japanese companies therefore have to adapt sometimes to other norms instead of expecting everyone to become Japanese. And so I do think that the shokunin spirit, which is such a deep strength in Japan, can become a weakness as well. And I experienced this time and time again in Japan over a variety of things. Like I remember going to a restaurant and ordering a hamburger, and then I just asked, what are the ingredients, like what's in the burger? It wasn't very clear. And the waitress like went away for half an hour and then came back with like this thesis of every single ingredient that had gone into like the flour and so on, because I had just wanted to know, is there going to be a tomato in there or not, right? Or I also remember going to doctors. Doctors were very risk averse. Yeah, I have a mole. It's still here, by the way. And I had this mole checked out in Brussels. And I remember when I lived in Belgium, and the doctor had just looked at it and been like, "That's not an issue. They'd named it and said it's not an issue." Then 8 years later, I go to a Japanese doctor because it had grown a bit and showed the same mole. And they were like, it could be cancer. We need to biopsy it. Because I just think that there's this idea that it's like, it's like there's no way that they could overlook the fact that it might be. You have to have it checked out completely thoroughly and eliminate everything. You cannot take the slightest risk that, even if it's a 0.1% risk that you gave a wrong diagnosis, right? But and I also think that there is a deep fear in the Japanese of somehow making a faux pas, and that fear of making a faux pas also holds them back. They are afraid of speaking badly in English. They are afraid of not knowing the etiquette in certain situations that they might not be familiar with. And so while I think Japanese culture has this emphasis on perfection, it's never the unexpected. And there is an alchemy that can come from experimentation that is missing. So that I think while in Japanese business culture and other areas, you have no misses, but you increasingly have not that many hits either, if that is the attitude that you're going to take. So the Indian penchant for jugaad makes it difficult to align with the business culture that prizes rules, reliability, standardization, excellence. The fact is, as Sato-san said, that's the $1 million rupee yen question, that how do you align these two very different cultures? Because if they can, their combined forces would be formidable. If you could find something that brings together the best aspects of jugaad and shokunin spirits together, if Japan could become more flexible and India could become more reliable, it would only benefit both, right? But how do you do that? I mean, I don't have an answer to that. But what I do have to say, because the third corner of my major interest and experience is China. And I think that when China is in some ways a place and a culture that displays key elements of both Jugaad and Shokunin mindset in its culture, which makes it a formidable opponent economically and strategically. And I think that if either of our nations, Japan and India, are going to even hope to rival our neighbors' heft, we have little choice but to move towards bridging this gap that we have that currently keeps us apart. So I will just leave it at that, and happy to
Great.
take any more comments, questions.
May I just come in for a second, Madam Chairperson?
Yes, please. So we'll now open the floor for comments and questions. Yes, please, sir.
Yeah, is that all right? Thank you, Pallavi. That was a fascinating discourse, which I thoroughly enjoyed. My connection with Japan is now 60 years, and this book was published in 2015, a year before you went to Japan on this last very fruitful journey. But you have two things I'd like to mention.
Yes.
You've mentioned a lot of the unique aspects of Japanese culture. I think there's one thing that we just need to underline. It's not terribly important anymore, but it's there at the back of the Japanese psyche, is the role of the imperial family and the imperial mystique, for whatever it is. And that is something which adds to all the convenience stores and all the other things that you have very correctly pointed out as being the ubiquitousness of the convenience stores and so on, as being an aspect, the cleanliness, the honesty, lost and found, and all that. But this, at the back of the Japanese mind, is an important thing. And it crops up every now and again when the question of succession comes up and whether, at long last, we're going to have
a woman.
Female. Yes. It was, in fact, when I was there a few weeks ago, it was on people's minds, especially after Prince Akishino produced the boy, young Prince Hisahito. But the idea is that the emperor's daughter is still there. So it's at the back of my mind. The second thing I just wanted to mention, you're quite right about the suppression of spontaneity and individuality and so on. And yet, throughout Japanese history, you find these extraordinary individuals, Ieyasu, Kurosawa.
Tokugawa. Yeah, Kurosawa.
Yeah.
See.
Tokugawa, Kurosawa, Akira, the great filmmaker, who is perhaps responsible for the greatest film that was ever made, the Seven Samurai. Ozawa, the musician, the conductor. I saw him the other day with Yehudi Menuhin, and he's suffering from some mental Alzheimer's. And yet, when he got up onto that podium and took his baton in his hand, the moment he was chatting with Zubin Mehta, he was chatting with Zubin Mehta, and yet when the cymbals time came or the drums time came, he left the conversation and pointed to where the cymbal had to come in. So that kind of individual excellence, which you find also even, there was a wonderful Hanga artist called Munakata Shiko, or a modern painter, Okamoto Taro. Great individualists, if you ever found one. And really, Abe Shinzo, in terms of the political milieu of Japan, sticks out as a great individual who plowed a lone furrow, if you like.
And Koizumi-san as well. You do have.
Koizumi was another maverick, yes. But Koizumi he brought many things to the fore which Abe followed. Koizumi left after 5 years, but you're quite right. He was also a great innovator in a sense, and broke many time-honored traditions. And Abe went even further. So suppression of spontaneity as a general rule, I accept, is an underlining feature of the Japanese psyche, and yet have these great individuals thrown up in Japanese history. Wonderful, wonderful listening to you. Thank you.
Thank you. The floor is open. Will there be any comments or questions for the speaker?
Well, if none, may I just intervene?
Yes, sir. And after you, then I'll also have something.
Okay.
And
Just
there's
a
one
few.
raised hand.
I think I would have loved to hear from Pallavi the great sensitivity that she expresses about the peculiar words in Japanese, like the feeling of a mother when she's cuddling a baby. Now, these aspects of Japan, sensitivity of a different kind, that Pallavi has brought out in her podcast interview. Would she comment on this?
I'm not muted, right? You can hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay,
Yes.
brilliant. Yeah, I mean, I have mixed feelings about this whole area where we sort of look at words and we invest a lot of meaning in those words, because when they are translated into English or another language, they often sound more exciting and special than they are in the original language, right? Like, so for example, in Hindi, we say namaste. Namaste is just namaste, it's hey, right? But if you actually translate it, it's like I bow down to you. And so if you're kind of saying that all Indians are always saying I bow down to you when they meet each other. It makes the English speaker somehow, sort of think of it in more exotic terms or somehow elevate it beyond the kind of everydayness that it has. And I think that there are so many words today that have become very buzzy in the, from ikigai to kintsugi and all of these things that are used a lot everywhere in the world to somehow like, oh my God, the Japanese are so special and unique. And again, feed into the Nihon Jinron trope of, attributing these words to them and somehow showing that they have like this unique sensitivity. But and so I don't, and I'm not sure that's true, because for a lot of Japanese people, the words have lost that magic. They're just another word, whereas they are magical for us because we are unpacking them. And so Shinrin Yoku is another example, which I think for most Japanese would just be taking a walk in the forest or whatever. But we translate it in English as forest bathing. And the fact that you have that idea of bath immediately opens a metaphorical universe up to us that makes us think that this is very special. But I don't think there's anything wrong with that either. I do think that sometimes we need to be able to look at the etymology of words, to look at words differently, to, as foreigners, we can perceive something in the words that is special, that people in the local language themselves, it's become blind to them, it's become opaque to them. But yes, I mean, Japanese is full of these wonderful words. I think I can't remember, is it sundoku or the word for the unread books that lie on your bedside table? But, I do also think that you have similar words in most languages, and that there's a little bit of a kind of commodification and a sort of trend recently to use a lot of these Japanese words for this kind of Oriental, the exotic, selling the world on this idea of Nihonjin tropes. So yeah, I don't know if that's answered your question, but I do think as a foreigner, there's a lot to be learned from looking at words, because we see them with their real magic, and that magic has often become lost to the speakers themselves.
Thank you. Yes, thanks.
I think we have a question from Sifra. You can just ask your question. Sifra Lenton, yeah, please.
Thanks, Lakshmi. Pallavi, it was a wonderful lecture. Thank you so much. What I wanted to ask you is, I haven't read your book, so I was wondering, have you had any interactions with the Indian community there? I mean, the old Indian community and the new Indian community, and how do they navigate their these two cultures?
Yeah. So more with the new Indian community, there are, of course, Sindhis. There was a significant Sindhi population in Kobe and now in Tokyo as well. But I spent quite a lot of time looking at the sort of newer lot that have arrived to work in software and the IT fields over the last 15, 20 years. And I think they all live in Edogawa mostly, which has kind of developed a moniker of Little India within Tokyo. And in the book, I specifically look at Yogi,
Yes.
Yogi Puranik, right? Who at the time had gained some local fame for having become the first Indian origin person to run for like a city councillor position, and he actually won it. So I went and I have went and met him, and I've talked about that discussion in detail in the book. And his whole story is very interesting. He talks about how it was difficult to be accepted in Japan as an outsider. That he was often he began by organizing very local community events like fairs, and found that he was often excluded because the Japanese felt like they didn't want to wash their dirty laundry in front of a foreigner. And so they wouldn't want to kind of include him in discussions and debates that they sort of saw as their internal affair. So even though he himself was, a fully participating functional member, but they wanted to kind of present a more united front in front of him. And it took a long time for him to get into it. He experienced racism. He experienced people telling him to go back to India and make nasty comments about, I don't know, like not using toilet paper in the bathroom and things like that. However, also, many people came out in his support and campaigned for him, and he won. And the fact was that even though he was the counselor from Edogawa, which is it has a lot of Indians, those Indians could not vote for him because they are not Japanese citizens. So all the votes that he garnered were actually from Japanese people who were sort of seeing it as necessary to have somebody like that because there were so many Indians in that area, and they wanted a bridge to be able to connect with the larger Indian community. So, I mean, there are challenges. People still have trouble with even simple things like sometimes getting people to agree to rent to them. It's not always easy to find housing, language barriers, cultural misunderstandings. However, Tokyo is changing. You're seeing the foreign population gradually increasing. Younger generations are much more open. And as we see more economic interaction, it's just inevitable that those interactions will grow, and we are seeing that.
May I just comment on that, Pallavi, your
Of
last
course.
remark?
Of course.
You were talking about Edogawa. You're quite right. That Edogawa ward and the neighboring Koto ward has a large concentration of Indians, which is why we located our school there.
Yes.
The Global Indian International
Yes.
School, which I'm responsible for. And we started it in 2006 with 120 children. We now have 1,500.
Yeah.
And the important thing to underline this question of cross-cultural fertilization, 60% of our children are Japanese. We have 19 other nationalities, of course, largely Indian, but Bangladeshis and Sri Lankans and all sorts. But that 60% of the parents in the area trust their children to an Indian school. I mean, it's the Global Indian International School. Of course, we run the CBSC, we run the ICSC, we run the International Baccalaureate and so on. But it is an Indian-run school. So that, you're quite right. Things are changing. And this hesitation about dealing with Indians and entrusting your children to an Indian education is improving. It's increasing with time. Thank you.
If I might just respond, Ambassador, one thing that people mentioned to me a lot in relation to that school and in general about India, like one of the most sort of positive associations that they had with India was this whole was math, essentially, which I find quite interesting because I always thought that, East Asians are like very good at math. But there was this whole idea of Vedic math. And my own Japanese teacher used to keep asking me about Vedic math, which I knew nothing about. And she was convinced I was a mathematical genius, which I really am not. But I think a lot of the students that I spoke to, like the parents whose Japanese parents whose children were going to the school that you set up, said that they were doing it specifically for the math because they believed that is the kind of foundation that they wanted. Which, yes, this is something that caught me unaware. This very strong association with India and math.
Maths and teaching of science, oddly enough, is again thought to be something that we are good at, but maths is the focal point. You're right.
Yes. Could we take one more question? And I'm really sorry, but I'm going to have to go after that.
Sure. There is one more person, Kanaka Pednekar, who has raised her hand. I think we'll take her question.
Yeah, hello. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Yeah, thank you for the talk today. I had read your book while I was studying Japanese, and I found it really interesting how I could relate to a lot of your struggles as well. And since I do want to go to Japan someday, it was very interesting to hear about it. I had one question while reading the book and during this talk as well, is that what does it mean to be a foreign correspondent, and how exactly do you become one?
So a foreign correspondent, yeah, it's a strange word. It basically just means that you are not in the country that of the newspaper or media that you are writing for. So supposing I'm writing for Indian media, I would be a foreign correspondent if I was reporting from a country that was not India. So whether it was China or whether it was the UK or the America or Japan in this case. But the media I was writing for was not Japanese media, but was Indian media. That would make me a foreign correspondent for that Indian newspaper. So, for example, I was a foreign correspondent for the Hindu in China, for the Business Standard in Brussels. And while I was in Japan, I was not working full time for any newspaper, but I was doing a column for the Hindu, a fortnightly column for the Hindu. So that is what a foreign correspondent is. And you do not become a foreign correspondent, you just become a correspondent. And then there are two ways. One is that the newspaper actually posts you to a foreign country, which is increasingly rare. Even in the developed West, we are seeing foreign bureaus shutting down across the world. Or you happen to be in that country, which has been the situation with me, in that I was in China, I was in Japan, I was in Indonesia for family circumstances. And I then was also a journalist. And so I reached out to newspapers and media in India, and ended up writing for them. But I have written extensively about and given lectures on a title which is The Lonely Job of the Indian Foreign Correspondent. And I call it being lonely because there never are any other Indian foreign correspondents. So I was the only one in Indonesia, the only one in Japan, and one of two when I was in Beijing, and the only one in Brussels. And there are many implications thereof, but this is possibly not the best forum to discuss that. But thank you so much for the questions. Thank you for this invitation. It has been a pleasure.
Thank you. If I could just quickly sum up today's talk, and I'll hold on to my questions and wait for the opportunity to perhaps ask you next time.
I hope so. Yeah.
Yes. So it's been wonderful having you here, Pallavi, and your book has shown the many-sidedness of being an Indian in Japan who has, of course, like Mr. Sato suggested and pointed out, has talked about the typical, stereotypical images that we may have, whether it is cleanliness, safety, being always on time. But it also looks at some of the other side of Japan, making it perhaps a little real in terms of how the Japanese may actually not be as much of a risk taker as an Indian, and they value the homogeneity of the society and so on and so forth. But what makes it especially very interesting is how it is a non-judgmental look at the whole picture, presenting both sides. And it is also perhaps a very good read because you at points have self-reflected upon your own Indianness in Japan, which again makes it wonderful for an Indian reader, looking at your own self as much as them. And it has been wonderful getting all the feedback and all the comments from our speakers. So thank you once again. And I'll now give the floor to Jain Sensei.
Thank you. Thank you so much, all of you. It's a very exciting lecture. And as usual, I mean, it is just a beginning and there are so many questions, so many more points to be discussed. So I think the purpose of the forum of opening up, that has been very well served, and extremely grateful to Pallavi, Sato-san, Ambassador Seth, and all the others. I can see that Sushila has been listening to us. She would probably like to have a word in the end. Sushila, just say
1 o'clock
something and finish.
Where Sushila.
Might be
Thank you
sleeping.
so much. Yes, finally, Pallavi, we were able to arrange Pallavi's lecture. And I'm really thankful to Ambassador Seth. And I'm also thankful to Sato-san. I mean, he's still, I think, sitting at the airport. And thank you very much, Lakshmi. And our next lecture is on Saturday, 14th December. by Ms. Mitsuko Takahashi. The topic is Gujarati diaspora in Japan, Gujarat-Japan relations.
Interesting.
So, yes,
Okay.
and at the same time, thank you. Thank you all
Bye-bye.
very
The invitation would reach all of you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very
Thank you
much.
very
Bye-bye.
much. Thank
Thank you.
you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thanks you.